Hello and welcome to this TIA series on technology impact assessment. Today's interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability project funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And this has been an ongoing project since November 2024. My name is Katina Michael, and today we have with us Sean Leahy. Welcome, Sean.
Hey, Katina, thank you for having me.
A little bit of a bio about you. You're an internationally recognized technologist and futurist. Um, you're an educator, steeped in education, currently at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University, and you innovate using humanistic approaches to emerging technologies. Tell us more about that role.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. So I think that role of innovating with humanistic an approach is something that spanned across my entire career, whether that's been in higher education administration or like I said in my current role, also working within like the Future of Being Human initiative here through ASU, is really has always been fascinated with the future around emerging technologies, but specifically around asking those questions, which you might hear this a lot from me today, is asking this question of what does it mean to be human in a technologically transformed future? But the future is somewhat meaningless if it is not human centric to us, because the kind of the goal and the sort of, I would say, the advocacy for a long time is really thinking about the human centered first when it comes to technologies to ensure that we, go towards a place of human flourishing and not one of sort of diminished agency or increased isolation and things like that. So it is always sort of working with a wide variety and across disciplines, very transdisciplinary approach to thinking about the roles of technology, leveraging lots of areas of future studies and different methodologies and things to step through those challenges and uncertainties, but ultimately with the aim of really working towards creating and thinking about an intentional participatory future that puts humans and human core values sort of in the center of those.
And Sean, as a futurist, what kind of qualifications and employment experiences have you had?
Sure. I mean, one thing that is really interesting about, in fact, I just had this question the other day of how do I become a futurist? Which is it's one of those types of roles where there are many different roads that lead to a place where you can be called a futurist. There is a theoretical and sort of scholarly pathway as well as a practitioner pathway. In my particular area, I started through university, went through telecommunications, media production. So I was really focused on the technology and the storytelling aspect. Later then branched into educational psychology and educational technology, where I was really focused on taking emerging technologies and thinking very deeply and critically about how we use those to learn. How do we learn? How do we teach? How do we learn through, with, and about technologies? And that really started to lend itself to this question of asking about, well, how do we define and work towards a future state where we can ensure that these technologies and things are not causing difficulties or harms? And so my own professional background, I say this a lot, it sort of only makes sense in hindsight when you see how those dots are connected. But I've always sort of had a foot in sort of three main areas. I've always had a foot in sort of technology itself, a foot in sort of media production and storytelling, and another foot inside of education. And sort of how those three pieces sort of have intertwined with me have been spread across a variety of different roles. Like right now, like you had mentioned, I sit in the Future of Being Human initiative as an executive director for that, a research scientist in the School for Future and Innovation, senior global future scholar, and that goes on. But before then, even here at ASU, I was the director of emerging technologies for enterprise technology. So the large sort of central technology department here for Arizona State University, and thinking about how do we leverage amazingly cool technologies. And funny enough, I was in that role when, of course, ChatGPT and all those AI technologies really came on the scene. So that was a fun ride. We've got lots of stories from that from that era. But also going back, I started my journey here at Arizona State University as the director of technology initiatives at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. So again, thinking about how do we take these emerging technologies and develop spaces and places for people to think critically about how these technologies help enhance our teaching and learning and how we use them essentially around this idea of tech for good. Um, and really thinking about those unintended consequences, those challenges that might arise. And all those kind of things really sort of led me to this way of discovering the discipline of future studies, and then diving sort of headfirst into that and getting intimately experienced with different futures methodologies and things like that to really help not only just think and vision about the future, but actually use quantitative tools to try to highlight scenarios so that we can examine those different types of futures to really think critically about the roles of technology in there. What are the affordances? What are the constraints, unintended consequences, unknown biases, all those kind of things as we think about the potential for these technologies to do good or potentially harm. And then, of course, how do we stay away from those harms?
That's a wonderful recap, I could say, and a lot of people would be thinking, now that sounds like an interesting career. I do remember you running a series of podcasts, and I said, Sean, you've got a podcast kind of voice, uh, and you're brilliant at what you do. And the Provost's office, of course, had asked you to do a whole bunch of how will generative AI impact our classroom and large language models and so forth. And that series was really cutting edge for its time, just
Yeah.
as GPT launched. Now, Provost at ASU had said, had tasked you with this, among many other tasks, I should
Right.
say. But you were fantastic at socializing the idea and making people feel more comfortable with airing their concerns and their hopes and the challenges that they would come up with in the classroom. Uh, when you reflect back, uh, what did that feel like, being at
Yeah.
that cutting edge?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think. Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment on the podcasting voice.
Yes,
Of course.
you still got
Um,
it.
I try. We run a small podcast, Modem Futura here. So, but I think when I think about what it sort of felt like in that moment is one, there was instantly the awareness that this was something special, that this wasn't just another new, fill in the blank technology. It wasn't a small increment or a step. That this was something big. It felt big. The ripples across even just the initial sort of, well, what does this do? And what I think for me was the most, I would say, rewarding part of that was really having this opportunity this is going to sound maybe, as I'm thinking about this might sound a little strange, but stay with me. Similar to some of the silver linings that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it really
Yes.
thrust our thinking forward because of necessity. The switch to, high flex, hybrid, different modes of communication, different modes of working, that accelerated, I think, a lot of those trends very quickly out of necessity because of that. And what I like in a sort of a similar way with the emergence of ChatGPT, for example, from OpenAI, was all of a sudden it gave us a lightning bolt to sort of shatter the way that we've been doing everything. I mean, you can feel like for me at that particular time is really thinking about how this technology is going to change fundamentally the way that we conduct teaching and learning in a world that has been transformed by this new technology. So it felt like the ground was literally upheaved and moving and very liquid, which is exciting because these are the kind of things that we think about and we talk about and we create scenarios of what ifs. And then for the first time, we were actually living this experience happening. And so right away, it felt like, when I had this sort of mental image of myself at that time of being like, there's this incredible tidal wave of new possibilities, good, bad, scary, wonderful, everything in between. And then the practical side of the institution and how things were normally done in terms of the histories of, the sort of the mechanics of how teaching and learning is done at a higher education institution, and standing between those things, trying to hold trying to hold the line
Yeah.
between both of those things simultaneously, while also trying to do a delicate translation between what the technology actually was, and what it could do, and really working hard to avoid overhyping or falling victim to this like mythical hype capability, but also at the same time recognizing that this is a watershed moment in the sense that the world will be different after the release of that, and that has held true. You know, I at the risk of going on long here, I have referred to this idea of low background steel, which is prior to essentially the nuclear testing in Nevada and stuff like that at the end of World War II, right? Steel did not have these radioactive isotopes in them, and now they do, and they're benign, they're safe, but they're present in almost all steel because they get absorbed out of the atmosphere. And so there is a technological signature now in human history
Mm.
of before and after. And right now, people will go deep sea diving and try to raise old shipwrecks to get steel for scientific instruments that don't have that. But you can see that there is this layer in the human history, and I feel like the AI component has done that as well, where it now after essentially, what was it, November sometime 2022, um, from this point forward, it will be increasingly difficult to recognize any sort of human activity and be able to clearly define that it has not been in some ways influenced by that exact technology. So that's this real. So in that moment, it was when I think back to it, it was almost, it was overwhelming at the time, but I think it was, it was exciting because every day was something new, and it was this just world shifting new technology that came out. So and yeah, so we tried our best to try to
You
make it
did,
make
you
sense.
did phenomenal.
That's right.
Those are
Right.
still among the best podcasts on generative AI that exist. And it was because of that newness factor and
Yeah.
that unknown element and what's going to happen next. But you were so balanced and steady in that whole series, inviting panels to targeted questions. You devised all of these yourself and strung them together, and there was like a story unfolding. And that went on for that 6 months. And then we had,
Yeah.
the first curriculums coming up
Yeah.
within a very short space of time. But these were like the nudges, the pokes. You were poking at that point, and people were like full on, let's explore. And that's the ASU attitude. But for me, when I look back, I think, what is the role of the futurist? And in the context of this, it was generative AI and emerging tech. But what do you think your role was looking back now at that early period of the
Yeah.
release of OpenAI's ChatGPT? What was the role that you took on, and what's the role of a futurist in this emerging tech space?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, I mean, I like to think, of course, in hindsight, I hope that, what I have done will map what I'm about to say here, which is the
Yeah.
role. And because I think, to kind of steal a quote from Wendell Bell, the purpose of a futurist essentially is to imagine, invent, and create these possible, probable, and preferable futures. So we talk always with futures as this plurality. And the idea is that now how you create those different futures can vary wildly. It can be quantitative, it can be purely visioning, but the point of it, and especially the point of futures, as we think about the role of new emerging technologies, innovations, disruptions, convergences, what have you, is that we take those and create these scenarios. So we talk about the futures in plural. So you usually there's three, but you can invent more, obviously. But the idea is then is you can examine those and evaluate those emerging technologies' impact in those different scenarios in terms of, what are the intended consequences of these new technologies? What are the unintended consequences? And thinking through those different scenarios to sort of critically plot or think out sort of first, second, even third order magnitude of impacts from those technologies, how they might ripple in their as the arrow of time moves forward, how would those emerging technologies potentially ripple through this very, in some cases, very unpredictable human squishy social behavior layers, right? And really trying to think about those impacts, and exploring how those different technologies again diffuse through those societies, and try to think about, again, who, trying to mitigate those harms that are possible. So part of the reason we would pull all these different possibilities together is to really think about which ones are desirable for us to reach, right? We hopefully, I would assume everyone would agree that we want to reach a place of increased human flourishing, right? That we have more agency, more autonomy, better quality of life, across the globe, not concentrated just in the global north or something like that. Um, but simultaneous to that is identifying those futures which we do not want to end up in, ones where we lose agency or we have a consolidation of control and disruptions and things like that that would limit our agency or increase existing inequities and things like that. And so by creating these different scenarios as we plot and kind of examine how these technologies might unfold, is then also developing, moving from this space of vision and story and moving into one of potential of action. And that's also where, from an organizational perspective, futurists like myself, we come in and we build essentially strategic plans based on those scenarios to think, and we use tools. I'll throw a bunch of names out here, right? We use tools like backcasting and horizon scanning and all these kind of things. But the idea is that once we can sort of plot out these different types of possible scenarios, and the key there is possible, these are not predictions, these are, possibilities. But we can build essentially a strategic action plan to help us understand and help us navigate those uncertainties that come with these new emergent technologies, because nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody can see the future in terms of, once we develop ChatGPT and launch it into the world, no one really knows over time where this goes. All the different adjacent possible developments or, good or bad that take place from those. And so really the role of a futurist in that respect when it comes to emerging technologies is really thinking about developing these different scenarios based on the uncertainties that we have access to, the trends, the signals, the things that inform our decisions, and then create those scenarios and then work backwards from there to see what actions are needed today, tomorrow, in the next quarter, the next year, the next 5 years, in order to help us reach those desirable states or desirable scenarios. And conversely, what are those same actions needed to make sure we mitigate the harm, we limit potential damages, and we stay away from, scenarios that are unpleasant, all the way up through, everyone's favorite in the futures world, the existential, crises and things like that. Which the ChatGPT launch was no shortage of, right? I mean, that was, the
Yeah.
machines are here, they're taking over. But so that's kind of like the role, is really sort of working. It's a very multifaceted, and there's lots of layers, and it's an incredibly exciting and fun space to be in, especially if you like doing different things all the time.
I just want to pick up on some of those comments you made. We had Jeffrey Hinton come up, post winning the Nobel Prize and
Sure.
really giving it to generative AI, which he had a lot to do with
Yeah.
it in terms of its development. And question I have is whether typically we see organizations like OpenAI, some of those big tech firms, embrace this futurist perspective. Obviously, they have because they've seen what's possible, but have they done the kind of work that you're talking about? And do you think there is a role for futurists like yourself in these big tech organizations to do the scenario planning, to do the
Mhm.
horizon landscaping and the backcasting, future casting, etc.? What's happening there? Are organizations using the tools that are available to them, or are they just going, look, we've just created a new innovation, bang, we're going to release it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I mean, I couldn't have seeded that question better to also explain, like, I think one of the so someone once asked again, how do I become a futurist? I said, well, maybe the world doesn't need more futurists necessarily like myself. What the world needs is every professional context there is to bring with them this concept of futures thinking and bring these skill sets and these mindsets. Because I don't think that a lot of organizations actually engage in this type of work. And so I do think organizations, especially the small sort of digital disruptors, like those small startup companies like OpenAI originally, like Anthropic, like these, I mean, I'm picking on AI companies right now.
Yes.
But I think it is a missed opportunity for them to not have some grounded futures thinking or grounded even futurists embedded within those organizations. Because I think often what falls is into this trap, and there's a futures thinking term here, sort of originally pioneered by Sohail Inatella, this idea of a used future. And a used future is not one that puts a quality of good or bad, but a used future is essentially this. Sometimes it can be completely subliminal, this tainted future that is because it is your bar. So when you think like, Katino, what does the future look like in 10 years?
Yes.
Instantly, you've been influenced by these organizations that say, we've got the newest technology, therefore all futures, we're central to every future that is coming. But that is a dangerous thing to have. One, the hubris, right? To say, of course, the future of our technology, we are the future. Nothing bad will happen, and we're going to just close our blinders and we're going to go forth at full steam. But damn the consequences. Don't worry, some other technology will come along and fix any of the damages we create. And so there really is a danger with that. And I think, I don't want to sound like an alarmist or anything, but I
No.
do think at present, again, this is an exciting time because we are seeing some of these things unfold directly. And your comment also of, some of these companies, especially in Silicon Valley, there's a movement that was sort of peaked a few months ago, maybe a year ago, that has dropped off in some of its is this idea of a TESCREAL future, right? Which again is layered and it has lots of elements of a used futures in it, but essentially they're imagining these future states to which the priority should be given to this future, basically this unborn generational future, even if that means in the short term we have to harm people or vulnerable populations, the environment, whatever it is, because the long-term payout of AI or generative AI tools, for example, will be so beneficial in 100 years from now that it doesn't matter how many low income housing units that we build data centers over. It doesn't matter because we're essentially giving priority to this unrealized potential human population over those people who, and again, it's never the wealthy affluent neighborhoods that get a data center, right? And so yes, so long way of answering. You asked me a short question, I give a long answer. That's kind of the deal here, I think.
Well, that's a great answer. A lot of our listeners would not be aware of some of the terms you're mentioning,
Mm,
and I'm sure people are going to follow up and learn more about the literature you've also mentioned. So thank you for that. Uh, Bringing it back to critical and emerging technologies. We've often talked in our research about network fallout, and that fallout. We know what happened when the atomic bomb fell. There was fallout, and
yep.
that beautiful description that you describe of the fallout to an extent that is permeating. And you said AI has that kind of element. I agree with you. For anyone who studied AI as one of the four major offsets in the history of the
Mm.
world, they would definitely agree with you, Sean. Um, Tell us what other technologies, okay, we've mentioned the AI aspect, but what are some of the other critical and emerging technologies in your eyes from where you're sitting?
Mm. Yeah, I think well, one of the elements that is increasingly interesting is the essentially the convergence of what you might call like the sort of the compute, so that the
Hmm.
chips and processing powers, the artificial intelligence, and the biological sort of engine or the bioengineering element. And so really this convergence of mixing essentially biotechnologies, computing power, and artificial intelligence, and those things together. I mean, that is a really interesting and sometimes terrifying space when you
Yeah,
think about it. When you think about sort of this cybernetic capability, there are these biohybrid type things. This sort of the melding of mind and machine, and for me, that is one, I think I'm drawn to that also because of the potential risk. Again, thinking about with all of these things, right, and I'll say this up front too, because if anyone looks at my work and goes and listens to your podcast, you'll hear this a lot, that I am sort of on a crusade against the hype that comes out of these large tech companies. Hype has its purpose, and it's a natural cycle of sorts. But the reality is also trying to make sure that we cut through those hype so that we don't inadvertently give up agency or control to something we can't control. And I think whenever we have these new sort of technologies that are coming together, again, like in the sort of cybernetic space as well, brain computer implants, different kinds of technologies that are again enhancing the personal area network of datafying all of our stuff, right? The things that are inside our bodies, outside our bodies, the things that our minds are working on and around, and influencing our conversations and our thoughts and all these kind of things, is again asking those questions of what what could possibly go wrong without these sort of elements. And I think once we're getting to elements of the biological engineering, really this idea that creeps into my mind is this idea of the concept of care. So we have these biofoundries that exist out there where we have this combination of essentially engineers and biologists working, to create new types of biological entities, right? So these are, microbial things. These are very tiny, but they have abilities that are at the surface level very, advantageous, right? If I'm ill, it'd be so much better if I could just pop a pill and let this thing take, if you've got high cholesterol, take a pill and let it clean you out and all that kind of stuff. That sounds great. However, anytime we're starting to play with things like the human genome, for example, using things like CRISPR or whatever, is not being able to really, again, carefully think through, if we create a genetically modified X, right? Fill in the blank.
Hmm.
How do we know what happens once it leaves the lab? How do we know what happens after it starts to go through the natural process of mutation and different generations of its existence? And then coming back to this is, again, this idea of care is really understanding, why are we doing what we're doing? What safeguards are we building in case it goes not the way we intended? Because that is the history that we've experienced. I mean, throughout human history, this happens time and time again. And it's really sort of this challenge of, with all these technologies, is understanding and thinking critically about, when we release it, we might have the dead set idea that it is going to do X, Y, and Z. And then in reality, in the environment, because we cannot predict the multitude of variables that are in those very complex systems, something can change, something happens, and then next thing you know, we have an undesirable attribute or a mutation or what have you. And so, yeah, so from another one of those sort of major tech areas is, I'm really looking at what happens in those bio areas, because there also is potential for massive leaps in medical, specifically personalized medicine. Even if we're working at the epigenetic layer, so above, not actually touching the genome itself, but manipulating proteins and things like that at the above the genetic layer, to be able to turn markers on and off. I mean, there are some really exciting medical breakthrough potentials there. But also, again, with that is, what if you make a mistake or you have unintended consequences? Those consequences themselves could be of the utmost catastrophic. So yeah, so those are some of the things that are besides the AI thing, it's a lot of the convergence in that digital and bio space have me really, my ears are very perked, very paying very close attention to the advancements in that space.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. Personally, having delved into this space myself for some time, it's definitely that convergence. And I think it was quite mythical in the literature. It was positioned mythically at one stage, say about 20 years ago, when we first had, around 2007-ish, deep brain stimulation devices and other things. But here we're
Yeah,
talking about actually organisms, right? We're talking about independent, autonomous organisms being, uh, created in petri dishes. Some of them
yeah,
fueling batteries, right?
yeah, yeah,
Some of them doing other kinds of nifty kind of independent tasks at the very, very nascent stages of how neurons communicate. But seeing this as an observer in a dish is confronting. And then a lot of these biofoundries, as you mentioned, are really experimenting. It's like, I don't want to call it back of the garage experiments, but
It has
there are
that,
more
it feels like
controls.
that sometimes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there are more controls in public biofoundries, and it's great for science and encouraging kids to get involved in STEM and
Yep.
to turn up and to learn more about the human genome and beyond. But also, where is this going? And we just had an announcement yesterday or the day before on the external robotic arm, the second recipient of a Neuralink,
Yep.
and how that is now through mind control being able to assist the person who requires the assistive technology. And that's
Yep.
all great potential uses. But when we look at it in the context of peace and stability, and perhaps in the context of conflict,
Mm.
uh, these kinds of technologies can look very, very different to assistive technology, which is about care, as you mentioned. They look very different. So the question I have is, how can technology impact assessments be utilized for peace and stability?
Yeah, that's a great question because I mean, that's the ultimate element, right? With any technology, is it can be used for the way it was originally intended, or again, I mean, people like to coming back to that robotic arm element. I'm like, if we ask the question like, what could go wrong? I'm like, have you ever tried to arm wrestle with something on hydraulic power? Like,
Yeah.
you will realize your squishy human form is no match to a hydraulic press. Um, and especially as people are developing like exoskeleton sort of, especially military
Mm,
applications of sort of like an exoskeleton war fighter frame or whatever they're calling it. So I think about this a lot. I have some experience just personally writing especially around AI and education, writing some policy briefs for the T20. So that's the T20 ahead of the G20. And so one of the challenges I think from that, I think is kind of what I'm drawing on with this question is thinking about um, that sort of technology innovation assessment as it refers to like peace and stability, as I think one of the roles that it can play is really sort of acting as this balancing effect or power. Sort of, but
hmm
what I say that again is sort of, if you remember my call back to me kind of standing in the middle of these things, is really to utilize this as a way of stabilizing what might otherwise be an increasing friction between the average person or the global citizen, if you will, the private citizen, and the tech companies, whether they be independent or government backed, that are doing a lot of the emergent technology innovation. So really pushing these things forward. And one of the things that we're seeing globally as well is as these emerging technologies are getting bigger and faster and these uncertainties are coming, we're also seeing a consolidation of that innovation, right? To the big tech companies, to the big players. And I think, you know, I worry that there's this sort of almost inverse relationship between sort of the transparency around and the sort of the intent around some of those the large companies developing innovative technologies and sort of this idea of peace and stability. Um, Kind of through that way of sort of what I think an approach to this is really thinking about um, advancing technological innovation that's rooted in I don't want to I'll use air quotes, in responsible, whatever. I mean, that's a loaded word. But this idea of responsible trust, that this transparency on the risks and the known and unknown consequences, throughout
hmm
these, who bears the cost of burden, the development, the industry, and really thinking about developing a shared language between the different parties that there be, whether these are geopolitical parties, whether this is an entire global agency, what have you, is really thinking about, how do you have a shared set of terminologies, of words, of shared values, even to understand the transparency of those risks and of unknown consequences. But also understanding the guardrails, or what are those risks of those mitigations and what are the policy implications of those. Thinking about how we've dealt with, beyond just sort of technology infrastructure or anything like that, or emerging technologies, is thinking about how we think about medical trials or how we think about nuclear energy, for example, as something which we've seen in human history. We've seen the devastating consequences of that, of either intent or accident, of that technology and what in that science and what has happened, but really starting to understand collectively sort of how do we talk about these technologies in a way that is shareable and understandable, as well as transparent in a way. So, because I do feel like
Yeah.
there is this inverse sort of relationship between the innovation and, in terms of like the peace and stability of what the average sort of global citizen has access to in terms of actual eyes or ideas of what's going on, but then also even the removal of them, it seems increasingly, from those government agencies that are making the policies. And, especially sitting in the United States, right, there is, very visibly a challenge with fewer and fewer people, coming down to handfuls of very wealthy individuals, very much being able to influence policy and politics and things like that, that are, in fact, changing and modifying the policies and laws and procedures that we're using. And I think that's a tension that needs a lot of attention.
That's a wonderful response. I was talking to someone yesterday. He was talking about something similar. He said if we could incentivize um, in ways to reduce suffering, then we
Mm.
wouldn't have these technologies of conflict. And it got us talking about dual use technologies. And I have a question for you, knowing how you analyze things for that aspect of the storytelling, for the what if analysis that you conduct and the
Sure.
futures work that you do. Isn't dual use an issue for every technology, or are some more predisposed to a paradoxical use of that tech for good or for harm?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I think generically, I think it's fair across the board, right? I mean, fire. I mean, you go look at, harnessing fire, right? You can
Hmm.
industries were born because we could harness fire, but also the number of cultures that were burned to the ground as a result. So there is that dual nature of everything, right? And I think that is part of just human nature of how we see these technologies as means to an end, depending on what that end might be. Um, that being said, I do think there are other technologies that might be either predisposed, right? So things that can very simply cause harm. Weapons are a perfect example, right? We can use these for hunting. We can use these in conflict to inflict damage and death across for humans. But thinking about different kinds of technologies, I mean, I'll come back to just AI, right?
Yeah.
In that sense, this is a technology where the challenge is the friction for using it in any way, shape, or form is very low, right? So if you want to, use the technology for a good or something that you define as good, and again, good could be heavily culturally laden with and value laden. So what's good from one group A may not be the same as good for group B. In fact, they could be complete opposites. But nonetheless, even if the intent is good, there is a side of that that is always the unintended consequence that gives rise to other things. Um, AI is an example of one of those technologies where once we start developing and understanding the multitude of ways it can be leveraged, right now, for me, one of the things besides automation, for me, one of the scariest parts of that sort of uh, well, either unintended or more scary, the intended use of that to cause destruction is around two things. One, it's the mythical element, so getting people to relinquish control. Jokingly, there's a pithy term just said like computer said no, right? Where humans no longer question what the computer says, we just go along. It's like whatever, right?
Mm.
Um, Giving up that agency is very dangerous. But also is leveraging those tools to intentionally manipulate individuals. So thinking about the increase in ability for us to create media campaigns through. I mean, if you've seen the examples of like Sora 2, for example, no longer do these AI driven videos have these clear hallmarks that they are, 10,
Yeah.
I shouldn't say 10 fingers because we have 10 fingers, but like 9 fingers on one hand kind of thing where you're like, well, that's clearly fake. So that's dangerous in terms of just using sort of tried and true tactics of manipulation, but now doing it in a way that is increasingly difficult to be able to spot or identify. So those are concerns that I have. The other piece that is a concern, as kind of coming back to this idea of conflict, is you know necessity drives innovation like crazy, and we know historically there is nothing. An element of necessity is fewer is I'm trying to think how to say this, is not as is never as great as one born out of conflict, right? When
Yeah.
life and death is at stake, humans are incredibly innovative. And so if you look at things like the conflict in the Ukraine, for example, a concern that I have is that there is technology, there is an consumer grade technology. So a lot of times thinking about drones, for example, the
Yes.
innovation that comes of being able to turn a technology that was meant, this drone is cool because I can fly it around my property and take cool pictures. Isn't that awesome? And then there is the sort of conflict adaptation of that, of like even something that is a simple, off the shelf technology of being able to weaponize that. Once that innovation process has taken place, that knowledge is out there. And it's no longer in the bottle, so to speak, and it is out, and other people can now learn that, use it in ways to whatever again, intent or even nefarious purpose that they might come to that. And so there is this tension of where that necessity drives some of these innovations. Um, and I feel like I'm starting to walk away here from the question, but one piece I will say in there too is something that I wrestle with, and that I talk about this quite a bit. And so anyone listening or watching, I hope this also would resonate, is, when we think about the role of the technology itself, if we come back to AI, right, there is lots of information out there. Where do we put the boundary of the technology itself? So like a large language model, should it just allow you, the user, to gain access to the raw information that it has essentially ingested? So that includes everything in terms of how to make weapons, how to do horrible things, how to do all these things, as well as all the things that we might generally describe as positive. But the question really becomes is, should the organization who develops it, like OpenAI or Google or whoever, should they build guardrails into that system?
Mhm.
There's often a counterbalance. I think a lot of people were like, yes, of course, there's harmful information. We don't want that out. But then there's the opposite viewpoint of that is, well, the information is there. Why would we, if we're essentially editorializing that by not letting you have access? And so is that the role of the technology, or is that a societal role? And then there's also the question too, like, well, if group A does that, there's no guarantee group B will do that, thus giving them an advantage in conflict, in financial market manipulation, whatever it might be. And so there's always this tension. And I think that is a question right now that we don't have a good answer for. But it's a question that I hope everybody is starting to, especially in like the policy area, that everybody is starting to grapple with, because this is not going to go away in a year's time. I mean, I think this is sort of, this is part of what we got to live with is figuring out how
Yeah.
we navigate this, because these systems have been able to essentially eat the world, in the sense of they've consumed all of human created, media. Um, but then the question becomes, well, what do we do with that? How do we control access? Is there information that we could agree upon across geopolitical boundaries that we agree is, that is not, we don't want that information in the hands of people? Or is that irresponsible to the generations to come down the line? I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
But it's the question that it's a tough one, but it's one I think everyone should be grappling with.
I think you're right. Underlying all of these advances in technology is data, and hopefully quality data, credible data, authentic data, that authorship can be determined. Because, as you said, we don't know, or we're having difficulty in picking out the types of data that are true and those that are not, beyond the historical pen and the cultural pen.
Sure.
And people might see this or perceive this as an attack on what was traditionally called the cyber physical social reality we live in, but now this cognitive layer has been added, this fourth dimension. So the cyber the physical, the social, and now the cognitive. And it's this.
Yeah.
It's what I'm seeing because of this attack on information through disinformation, misinformation campaigns. As you said, it's very easy to generate these, and for a group to believe certain things, even though they're untrue, whether that's in moving form or that's in text. Uh, Interestingly, the headlines as well continue to be trying to gain the attention of people. So they're not really in the best interests of the people. They're very different to the headlines that we used to read in the
Mm.
40s and 50s and 60s. So the question I have is, with this technology now that we know, as you said, that's the technology, but what's underlying that? What's feeding it? And you said it, I love the expression, it's eating up the whole world. Anything that was digital, yes, and in fact, increasingly with sensors now and image sensors on fixed poles, not just the digitized, but the natural or the analog becomes now a part of that digital landscape. So the question I have is, how do we protect this, Sean? How do you how do you protect the brain either through
Oh,
overloads of messaging, wrong messaging?
oh, that's a simple one. Tinfoil hats. Right? I mean, a
You go
tinfoil hat and a
first.
sandwich, tinfoil hat and a sandwich board, right? I mean, we've already, no, I think so. That is, increasingly, I think that's going to be the question of questions. Because, you know, the way I've talked about this before is one of the big challenge, and I'm just going to keep picking on AI right now because it's the easiest monster in the, to
Yeah.
pick on. Um, One of the big challenges that we have is that AI has reached a level where it has essentially become intertwined in almost all aspects of human activity.
Mm-hmm.
And even people that don't actively use or seek out an AI tool, the possibility that they are highly likely that their other activities are already being either have been or will be influenced by those same systems and they don't even know it. Um, Everything from decisions that are made about them, their situations, their data, or all the way through messaging and things that are coming directly, being served directly to them.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about like how do we protect the space, one, I think there is a component here of, and I hate to label this because everything has a literacy, right? So there's media literacy, but I
Yeah.
think there really is an element, especially as we are now you can say, and I have said this before, I've talked about this just in class not long ago, is I mean, humans have always been using technologies to change the narrative, to change the message, right? I mean, even photo manipulation goes back way beyond Photoshop, going back to the origins of photography and using darkroom techniques to change and composite photos together to create a story that wasn't really there. Um, but still, I think there's this growing need to understand what the potential capabilities of these systems are. All the way down to, we were just, I mean, literally, this was just even this morning having looking deeply into some of the new, for example, Atlas, the new Chat GPT browser, right? You now
Yes.
have this AI controlled browser that is essentially a stranglehold, or think about it as like a keyhole that you're viewing the world's information through.
Mm.
And there is a little to know for certain that those what you're experiencing has not been altered or changed because they literally are sitting in the middle. So even using those cybersecurity things, right? You have the classic man in the middle sort of attacks or prompt injections, anything where your information you're retrieving is first passing through some kind of intermediary. So even that, like even doing generic online
Mm.
behaviors, it's very difficult to ask or to know the answer to the question, am I being manipulated right now? Um,
Mm-hmm.
Even things like we've talked about in the past, even things like, you and I are connected on Zoom and we know the technology is there. I don't think it's active right now because these smiles are genuine.
They
Uh,
are.
but we know that you can manipulate facial expressions on video
Yes.
in intercepting those. So, what happens if I'm on an interview and I'm like, I would rather look smart and happy or something than
Yeah.
sad and lonely, or I don't know. Um, but so that is happening. The technology is there to do that. And so one of the challenges that I think is about this literacy of understanding and even understanding at a very young age. And so I had fantastic conversations recently with a K-12 or specifically K-6 technology educator who is really working on how do you start talking about AI to kindergartners, right? So very young learners, 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah.
And starting that conversation at that age, because of course they already are influenced, but they will have this now probably, for the foreseeable future that'll be a part of their life. And how do you start understanding, or especially at a child at that young age, that the things that you're getting, how do you verify that they are what they are? And are they human created? Are they not? Is it is it
Mhm.
being a manipulated image? Is this a historical image? Like, how do we start to tell? And I think that is a really deep challenge that doesn't have a simple answer because it's going to require, I think it's going to require policy regulation around what companies and putting guardrails on what uh, companies or organizations can do. But I think equally with that is also going to take a social element of norms and behaviors around these different technologies to understand, to change the conversation in some ways, that what might have always been sort of a safe space for, well, I saw it with my own eyes, therefore I believe it. We might need to really think critically about now is the time to really start to challenge those things. And as we continue sort of push into this digital space in terms of our communications, our relationships, where we're sharing, getting our information, where we're putting our information, is also understanding how much of these platforms, especially if you look to social media, for example, how much of this content is synthetic, right? So even the things that we're consuming through news channels, through web searches, through social media, the increased amount of synthetic data that is being put out there from these generative systems is also troubling, because how do you know now, back in 2005, and you remember we all had RSS readers and you'd get all these updates and you're like, oh, what's happening in the blog sphere today, right? You knew there was a human behind those. That's no longer the case. I don't think you can say with any certainty now that you
Yeah.
can't tell what in your news feed, for example, is a synthetically generated content, or even in social media platforms, if users are actually authentic or synthetic. And I think this is it's a different world. And I think the troubling part that I think about this, and again, I have small children, so this is something I'm living this challenge right now as well, is how do I effectively, because I also have a love for technology and I'm always playing with these tools. So I'm bringing all this stuff
Yes.
home. But also is like, how do I teach my own kids to see the signals and to be critical about when you're being fed information, when you're being fed things that are like, oh yeah, of course I would like more of that. Um, is to being self-critical as well about, do I trust this and how do I know? Because it's no longer the case of, it came from a reputable website as like, oh, I can trust this link. And so I think in that regard, the technology is ahead of where we are, in both in terms of policy and regulation, but also in terms of social norms. I think things swing as pendulums and it will catch up. Right now, we're also seeing sort of mixed in this conversation is also a growing movement or backlash on generative created content with terms like AI slop and clankers and things like that, that really are signaling people are getting concerned or fed up, or they're annoyed by this and seeking things that are authentically human. But again, it's a very challenging problem right now, and I think one that is going to be, again, this is going to be a challenge. I mean, we haven't even figured out social media yet, so we're
Yeah.
still working on we'll be working on this a long time. And I'll just mention it, but we don't have time to get into it. Is also the other side of this is also the psychological dependency of individuals using these tools for companionship, right? Both platonic and partner relational, and so that's another huge element of this as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
again,
I, I, I think,
short question, long answer.
Sean, these are critical discussion points that are very relevant to technology impact assessment, and at a bilateral scale between governments. these are the discussions that we have to have. Once upon a time, we were teaching kids that, oh, see this YouTube influencer, they're using product positioning while they're
Oh, yeah.
unboxing. Oh, no, they're not. They don't have the XYZ brand behind them because they're unboxing, ABC. Okay, see this video, but it's not about that anymore. It's gone completely different. I had a reporter recently, about 3 days ago, ask me about whether there was any solution to Sora 2 videos in our local area in the Illawarra, uh, depicting scenes of tragedy,
Mm.
like cars or a bridge collapsing, one of our latest bridges that is very scenic, or a car having gone in and inadvertently hurt someone, etc., etc. And well, what can you do with that? And the response in the write-up was people have to become more digitally literate. Yes. But can you stop companies from producing these tools? No, they're just tools, but how we use them. And as you said, people are being fed up with, so if it's not humans that are using them in interesting, bizarre, nefarious ways, then it may well be bots in the future that
Yep.
have been tasked by humans to create these. So interestingly, when we talk about guardrails, but how? And these are the conundrums that you point out really clearly in all your examples today. If I go back to the instrument of TIA, and I say to you, when you hear technology assessment or technology impact assessment, what ideas does that conjure up?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, the way this is where we're going to learn right now live if I've got it right.
There's lots
Um,
of lots of definitions to this, Sean. Go
okay,
ahead.
good. All right. So things, that's the beauty of the plurality of things, right?
Hmm.
As a futurist, I love that, right? But for me, when I hear like TIA, to me, what this, because again, I think I've already used the term responsible innovation. Um, and those are things that I think about that are very complementary to one another. But when I hear of the TIA, what I think about is something that is done sort of on the pre-deployment side of things. So that has so it's like pre-deployment, but with like checkpoints kind of throughout its technology's existence. But really, that it is a review of and clearly sort of stating sort of like the potential benefits, risks. But I think in my view, most importantly, it is the knock-on effects or the downstream impacts on the stakeholders. So that's the people, the fundamental rights, safety, labor markets, environment, um, and all of the sort of remediation that comes with that as well. Like, what are the mitigations for those risks as well, so that so again, in my mind, it's like the TIA serves as there's a technology. Here is all the potential things for good, bad, and the ugly, and everything in between, and how it might propagate over time. Which again, from a futures perspective, this is something that is of interest. But then also, here are potential or draft language even around how we might mitigate those risks or mitigate those downstream effects if those happen to be negative or something. So that's how I've always kind of thought of the role of those technology assessments.
And in terms of criteria or perspectives that you'd cover, we call it a technology impact assessment, but to you, is it multidimensional? Is it transdisciplinary? What are the sort of things that we should be addressing in there in terms of criteria?
Yeah. I 100% transdisciplinary. I mean, I'm one of those people when you say like, again, I have a long history in ed tech and people say, well, what is technology? I'm like, for me, I mean, you're sitting in a chair, aren't you? Well, that is a form of technology. So for me, tech is big capital T. It is technology. These are things that are not found in nature that are created by humans. And so from that perspective, I think it does kind of cross all of these elements. And so is multifaceted and not just focused on a single layer or a single or narrowed down to a particular place. Cause I think, um, I don't know if we'll have a chance to talk about some of the challenges of these types of tools. Cause with all these responsible innovation as well, these are types of things where one of the downsides to them is that if the scope isn't big enough or wide enough, they can fall into this trap of just being a check mark where you're like, oh, yep, we did that, but we didn't really do it at the large enough layer to really understand the potential. And then I would interject too that that is a role of a futurist can play in those types of organizations, is to really be asking those what if questions around those assessments to make sure that we're also scoping and scaling that assessment at the right level, understanding that if you go too big, right, you can get lost in the endless possibilities. But if you go too small, you might have a false sense of understanding of what those benefits risks might be, not seeing the bigger picture. So, yeah.
Hmm. And where do we go to get that data that informs the TIA? You mentioned all these stakeholders, but what does that data look like? Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? Is it where do you go to get that? And what kinds of methods, given your futurist hat,
Sure.
and approach to the human-centric side and mindset, where do we get the data to inform our TIAs?
Yeah. Well, one, it's not a single. I mean, the first thing is it's not a single source, right? So you can set that aside. The challenge there is also looking. So I think, is it quantitative or qualitative? I say it's both, because and there's different ways we can get to different technologies. Like, so for example, in the futures perspective, a lot of what we do is we start by doing these. Because even that's a question that I find interesting, is like, well, when and where do you start with one of these kinds of things, right? Well, one, yeah, from the futures perspective, we deal a lot with this concept of horizon scanning. So what we're looking for are signals, drivers, trends, and signals. For example, are these very small. Like a signal could be a new innovation, a patent was created. Somebody discovered a new way of doing something. Drivers are something that tend to be a little bit larger. We're seeing an industry sort of move in some way. A trend is even larger than that, where you see multiple things building, sectors developing, maybe new economic sectors even coming up. So those are the kind of things that we'll look for to signal, hey, there's something new here. There's something to pay attention to here. And these aren't always new things. These can also be new ways of either converging or adapting existing technologies in ways that have never been done before, right? I mean, think of something like the GLP-1 drugs, right? And how originally, used as a diabetic control, also be like, wow, also great for weight loss. And now also seeing some of these neurodegenerative aspects of also some interesting science is showing that it is also potentially a good treatment for things like Alzheimer's. And so some of those innovations also are not new themselves, but new applications. So when we think about those as well, also looking at some existing methodologies in the futures toolkit that we'll use. So, everything from doing these horizon scans, doing again what's called a futures wheel, which is taking these different things, and that is where you sort of plot out those first, second, third order implications. So if this happens, what then? If this new thing is created, what then? And sometimes there is actual data that is there that you can get. 20 new companies are pumping out this, that, and this. We can measure those things. Other times it is an assessment. So things like using the STEEP protocol. So when STEEP is an acronym with two E's in it, that is social, technological, environmental, economic, and policy/political, right? So
Yeah.
where is there's an innovation, where does it have potential impact? You can quantify those things as well so that you can work from sort of quantitative data. But also what is very important also is, again, I've mentioned it a couple of times, I think, is that really difficult, squishy, because the humans are social creatures. Also understanding what is sort of the response to these technologies from the cultural, a behavioral, a social perspective. I think also, so getting those narratives, understanding culturally how these technologies might have changes, and being able to pull these things together so you can have data to understand, hey, how do we balance the risk? Well, there's lots of tools out there that we can do these risk analysis on, X, Y, and Z. Asking these questions like, how is it impacting people, right? How is it impacting individuals? How is it impacting groups? How is it impacting, civil society levels? What are the regulation and standards? How would that come into play? And kind of pulling these things together to sort of, in my mind, this is like a tapestry of quantitative data around things that can be measured, but then also a lot of qualitative data around how people feel or the perspective of these things from especially like a cultural sense, I think also is um, very much needed or necessary to sort of, again, from a futures perspective, bringing these things together to create scenarios. And a lot of times we do that through storytelling, right? It's an easier way to sort of consume them. But to create these scenarios that can, again, sort of paint a picture of these possible different futures to understand, yeah, that is where we want to be, or no, 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 we do not want to go there. And then thinking about what else do we need to understand how to get there or how to stay away from that? What are those different pieces that we need? What are those gaps that we have in terms of our existing capability or understanding versus where we want to sort of end up?
This has been a absolutely fascinating and very in-depth interview, Sean. As we get to the close, I wanted to ask you, based on what you just said, to you, is a TIA a once-off assessment tool in a technology's life cycle? What does it look like, and how might we innovate in sort of modern TIA developments?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the quick answer is I hope it's not a one-off. Even though, again, I think when you asked me sort of my sort of definition of it was sort of like this, on on the front side of these technologies. And I think that's the first on the timeline, right? That kind of
Mm,
matches and goes with it. Because I think what's important is we've seen the technology when it is initially developed is done so in a, you can think of this like almost like Cartesian coordinate of, X, Y, Z, and Z in terms of like when in time and space was this technology deployed,
mm,
move the time arrow down, and those conditions change. And so the technology evolves, the society, the people, the places, all those things, those are independently or in some ways they're maybe all linked together, but they are also changing. So I do not think it is a one and done. It should be a cyclical or iterative process, right? So that we're now the depending on the scope and scale, that might determine how often you do this, right? You probably can't do it every week, probably not every month, maybe not even every year. But define that's part of that transparency is agreeing upon what is an appropriate level of revisiting these technologies to just ensure that again we are understanding what those risks and benefits and downstream impacts might be. So thinking about it again is like on the front side, it's like the exploration and design sort of elements, the building and procurement of these things, pre-deployments and working through what, again, how do those understanding the human rights impact or other things like that these could have,
yes.
having periods of either, I guess you could go by pilots or sandbox or something like that, where you have time trials to sort of let's
Hmm.
put this in the wild under safe conditions and see what happens to then inform us before we're ready to just go, here you go, go off and running. And then this idea of also thinking about with these technologies is what is the plan for like updates or even decommissioning these technologies, right? So
Yes.
that they're not created with this idea of they will just be forever. Um, this is an area that I get really sort of cranky about when we talk about space. Is this idea of like we'll just throw up satellites and we won't worry about how we bring them back down. It's like no, that's part of the process. We should be thinking about the end of life of these things from the beginning so that we
Yeah,
don't end up somewhere. I just envision this horrible trash pile of all these, Starlink satellites or something just piled up a mountain high.
me
Um,
too.
but that's kind of like this idea is that this should be a cyclical experimentation or a cyclical evaluation to understand what has changed and as it is today moving forward what do we see, because it also builds in my mind, this also builds in a great opportunity for reflection, right? From the time we did it before, what has changed, what were the markers of success, were those benefits or those harms realized, and if they were, to what extent? And that gives us a really, I mean, I think always with the danger of any of these new technologies is that we get excited, we build them, we launch them, and then we forget about them. And they
Yeah.
just exist or they become part of a different infrastructure where too much time goes past, and then changing them could be potentially very disruptive because they've become baked into a different, more complex system. And, you've lost your opportunity to sort of get in there and sort of reevaluate those technologies.
My second last question is, if I say the words joint technology impact assessment, what does that joint mean to you in
Mm,
different contexts?
yeah. I think simply, I think joint doing that joint assessment uh, really comes down to uh, com- uh, um, common ground, so
Hmm.
common language, common tools, working from the same idea. And I know there's historically we've had some success with, like, OECD, for example, around some of the AI stuff. Um, but this idea of when you're bringing more than a single entity together is you have to have this shared language. Otherwise,
Yeah.
people will walk away. It'll be confusing. It'll be misunderstood. And maybe at worst, even having a contentious understanding of the same of the language. I think we also need a convergence of, like, standards, right? So because
Hmm.
what might be standard in one, especially if you think of it at the country, the independent nation level, what might be a standard in one might be nowhere near a standard of another, or they even could be competing. um, and then also is uh, a clear identification of the hindrances or the complexities of a joint, a joint assessment, and thinking about what are sort of like the way you might sort of predefine conflict resolution, right? So, like,
Yeah.
when things aren't going well, how are we going to resolve discrepancies, differences, conflicts, what have you, even in that process of understanding what this means, and also understanding what type of issues we might evolve. So it's almost like a little mini version of, like, what are the things that could go well and go wrong just in this joint relationship, right? So because if you think about the different regulatory and sovereign way things that are
Mhm.
governed, right? I mean, that's can be wildly different depending on the organizations, but also things that can be very technological in nature, but difficult in policy, like sharing data. Um, how does one exfiltrate data from one nation to another and back and forth with in a way that is seen as, fair or equitable, or, I'll show you yours if you show me mine, but I'm not going to be the
Yeah.
one to go first, right? And then also asking deep questions about, even in that joint group, is where are our gaps? What do we not have that needs to be here, including people, right? Who is the voice that will be impacted by that is not represented amongst our joint sort of venture in this space, knowing that they could be one of the groups, and this could be just also including the environment, could be one of the people or entities that is
Yes.
potentially damaged, right? So it's also under knowing and identifying. Now, you can't invite everyone to every table, but by identifying who's missing automatically will help you guide those questions and asking those what ifs, so that you, while they might not be able to be participating, you can still do right by those groups by at least engaging with what you're able to do in capacity of understanding how it might impact them and asking those questions. That's at least far better than just pretending that they don't exist.
That's a great response, if I may say, and will help us in our analysis when we're talking about those bilateral relationships and
Yeah.
how two governments could be on speaking terms and could have a shared vocabulary and a shared number of goals, whatever that is, for a technology impact assessment on X or Y. Um, as always, my last question is there anything else you want to add? Uh, or have the opportunity to speak about related to this interview?
Oh, Katina, that's a dangerous question to ask me as a I'm
I've
like,
got time.
and now we'll start and so now it's time where now you're on my show and we'll ask a different question. No, I think I first of all just thank you for this opportunity to chat with you, because it's always
Thank
amazing.
you.
But also I think this project is really interesting and these questions have been fascinating to really um this is some of that exciting work that as a futurist you really start getting engaged because of once you start getting your fingers there, the complexity just keeps going, and the richness for an opportunity to really, hopefully have a positive impact. Um, I would say the one thing that, and again, this kind of comes back from my perspective, one as a futurist, as a faculty member, but as one of those people who has spent a large amount of time and energy of trying to bring the conversations, the ideas, the concepts, the skills, the mindsets that typically reside in what you might call like an academic ivory tower or whatever.
Yeah.
The idea is to really catalyze those conversations in the public. One of the things that you'll hear, if anyone hears me talk on stuff around futures, is I always will talk about this idea of sort of like the citizen futurist. And the idea behind that is to really think about this idea of a participatory futures. That the point here is to catalyze these types of conversations that you and I are having. They're not only happening in higher ed, government policy, they're happening in
Hmm.
boardrooms, but I want them to be happening at the dinner table, at the bar, at the cafe over, coffee or tea or whatever. Because the average citizen, I think this is one of the biggest power grabs that we've sort of let happen, is that the average
Yes.
citizen has tremendous power in
Yes.
shaping the landscape of where technological innovation goes and where it's come from. If we stay quiet, if we're okay with being left out of these conversations, it's easier for that concentration of power and wealth to happen. But if we can stimulate these conversations, give rise to a more informed public, a catalyzed public around these ideas, um, they can help steer these regulations, these policies, these social norms that can enforce generation of innovation and development that puts humans at the center, and hopefully increase our chance for a future that is flourishing. Right? We want
That's
that,
right.
and not one ends up with less agency, increased isolation from the very things that make us human. And so I think what I would just end with is a call to action. Right? So for anyone who's either listening to this, watching it, or reading it, is to ask this question of what does it mean to be human in the future? And to really ask that question, not in just a pithy kind of like, oh, that's a fun little way, but really think about that in the context that you bring to the word future, right? And think about what actions can you start taking today to catalyze the future that you want, and to really kind of take that to heart, and to have those conversations when the next time you're at the pub, the next time you're at the coffee shop, whoever you're there with, or a dinner or a family get together, ask somebody that question. What will it mean to be human in the future? And see where the conversation starts to go, because those conversations are absolutely beautiful. And I think we need to be having them more often.
Well, Sean Leahy, on behalf of the Social Cyber Institute, we thank you for bringing attention and this call to action. We agree with you. And I think you'll be inspiring many people for many, many years to come. Thank you for being so prepared. And thank you for taking the role of interviewee when you're
Yes.
usually the interviewer. But one of the most well-read people and experienced people in this space that I know. So thank you so much for your time and energy.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Katina. It was an absolute pleasure. And this was so fun being on the other side of the microphone for a change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again.
Great. Thank you.